All right, guys. I didn't know how to do this explain this while actually looking at the golf cart, so I decided to draw out three scenarios on how the um, clutch system works with a torque spring installed. And this comes from a subscriber asking if you put on bigger tires, is there a negative effect on the golf cart torque? And how would putting a spring help with that? So I decided to draw it out for you guys so that I could explain this and kind of show you what's going on. Let me start off by saying that DIY Golf Carts did a great video on how to install a torque spring into a Yamaha G29. They pulled the pulley off, they installed the spring, showed you how to do it. It was a great video. That's what I used. Now, I know there's a different variety of torque springs out there now. When I bought mine, it was only the factory or an upgraded torque spring. Now you can get many different weights. So there's a tuning aspect to it. I'm not familiar with that. Most companies selling those are going to have it kind of broken down for you. So if you buy a tuning kit for your golf cart, they know which one to give you. Or if you just go on eBay and buy a torque spring, you can't go wrong. I have the yellow one. They seem to be color coded, but the one I use is yellow. So I'm going to explain how the pulley system works real quick, and then I'll show and explain how putting in that spring is going to have an effect on the golf cart and what that does for you as far as torque goes. So let's start with the top here. I put these together like gears in a car, and with the pulleys that expand and contract over 0 RPM to full RPM, you could argue that there's an infinite amount of gear ratios in between there. I just decided to pick 0 RPM, middle RPM, and full RPM. So you could say gear 1, gear 2, and gear 3. So when the cart is standing still, the front drive pulley is the small as it could be. So that means that the belt right here has to go around a really small part of the pulley. We're going to say a small gear, and they'll go around the biggest gear that it could be, the driven pulley. So you have the drive pulley and the driven pulley. So in first gear, very small to very big. And I don't know if this is accurate. It's probably not, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to say it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every 2 turns of the front pulley, the rear pulley turns once. So that gives the engine an advantage. So you have a lot of torque. That engine can get the momentum going, can get that weight moving forward. Then as you go up in RPM, the front pulley contracts, comes together, making itself bigger so that the belt has to go around a bigger pulley since it's coming closer, and the rear pulley is expanding, going from the biggest it can be, like up here, and it's getting smaller. And we're going to say right in the middle, they're the same size, just like we have here, and that would be a 1-to-1. So for every 1 turn of the front, there would be 1 turn in the rear. So that the engine would be, you could say it would have no advantage. It would be 1-to-1. So this would be your slow moving kind of cruising speed. So the engine's not working too hard, but it is speeding up. You're going to notice a speed in the golf cart. And then when you get to third gear at full RPM, the front pulley is contracted as much as it can go, making the belt have to go around the biggest pulley first and then go all the way back to the smallest pulley at that point. That's at full RPM. So you're talking max speed at that point. And we're talking essentially gear ratios, gear management. So I know it might be a little difficult to grasp, but this is roughly what's happening as you push the pedal and as you gain speed. Now, you might be at full throttle, but not moving as fast. So, even though you're at full throttle, you might still be in first gear or second gear, but that's the golf cart working to move that weight forward. And here's how the torque spring helps with that. And I kind of drew a top view, like if you're looking down on a golf cart. This is the front. That is the back, or the front of the golf cart, back of the golf cart. The front pulley, when it's at 0 RPM, the front's gonna be spread apart as wide as it can be, making it the small gear, and the back is going to be as close as it can be, making it the biggest gear possible with our 2-to-1 ratio. As the golf cart goes up in RPM, this is the front of the golf cart, that's the back of the golf cart. At full RPM, the rear expands as wide as it can get, making the gear small as possible, and the front pulley on the engine is going to contract as tight as it can go, making it the biggest gear possible. So when you standing still, this spring is pushing the rear pulley as close as it can together, making it the biggest gear. With inertia and with the weight of the golf cart and the engine RPM, this spring is fighting the force spreading it apart. And as you gain speed and load on the golf cart, it will eventually widen. And the pulley up front will contract, but we're going to be worrying about the rear pulley. That is where the torque spring goes in. Now, with a golf cart that just has two people, unmodified with the factory tires, they've calculated that spring weight is able to manage the engine RPM balance with the load so that you're not overexerting the engine. It's not going to hurt itself, and it's also going to have good acceleration. Sorry about that. Now, where was I? When you put on bigger tires, that means that the golf cart's going to have a disadvantage. It's bigger tires, you're losing torque, you're gaining top end. I'm not going to go into that part, but just know that when you put on bigger tires, if you don't change anything, it's going to go faster at a faster top end speed, but not have as much torque. And that comes from gear management. We're going to call this gear management. When it feels the resistance and however fast the engine is spinning, we're working with physics here, which means that all this has to be calculated out, and the guys at the factory have done a fantastic job. But if you put on bigger tires with an increased load, you are essentially putting an extra weight on the golf cart, so it has to manage the gear shifting like a manual transmission better. And what people have found, when you put on bigger tires, when you go to accelerate, this is going to be very quick with the factory spring to expand, which is not what you want at an accelerating at the beginning, or if you are cruising along and then you find yourself going up a hill. You want this rear pulley to contract sooner so that it goes back to being bigger than being smaller, giving the front pulley, the engine, the advantage. So I know this is a little hard to grasp. I'm trying to explain it the best I can. So the factory spring will not manage the load and the gearing as best as possible, and that's why you put in a torque spring. What the torque spring does is it's actually a stiffer spring. It's harder to compress, and it compresses moving towards the drive box. So it would be moving this direction. That is going to have a tendency where when you are sitting at 0 miles per hour, or as you're driving and you go up a hill and it feels an extra load, as the RPMs slow down, this is going to want to naturally contract quicker, making itself bigger, making the belt want to go around a bigger pulley rather than staying in a lower, smaller gear when that load is increased, either going uphill or in acceleration. And there actually has been talk about how the factory spring sometimes, if it's heavily used and it hasn't been maintenance, like there's a little grease nipple on there that you're supposed to service. You just want to make sure dust and silt are cleared out of it, just general maintenance. But sometimes that spring can stick. So it will never get back to being a small in the front and as big as it can be in the rear. It will stay it will stay smaller than it should. So by upgrading that spring in the rear driven pulley, it is managing the gearing a lot better on the fly than just the factory spring. So if you have an unmodified golf cart with two people and you want to put on bigger tires and you generally are driving on flat ground, you may I would say you probably don't have to do this right away. It's good if you do. It's better for your golf cart, but it's something you don't have to do right away. But if you have a golf cart that you want to put on bigger tires with two people and you know you're going to be going up and down hills and putting it under load, at that point, you want to put the spring in, and you absolutely want to put the spring in if you are putting on bigger tires and a rear passenger seat, which means an additional 100 pounds and the weight of the riders. You're going to want the torque spring so that it can manage the gearing a lot better. That's a very simple way of putting it. This is just my suggestion. I would put it in to just keep the life of the golf cart and not overwork your engine. But refer to DIY golf carts. They did a great job explaining how to install it. I had to use a helper as well. It's definitely a two-man project, but it's not impossible. But it's a great cheap upgrade. It's not that expensive. It's easy to do, but definitely worth saving your the extra work on the engine. Well, you guys have a good one.